This podcast is brought to you by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family owned and operated. By the Diocese of Huron, a community where families and individuals from Windsor to Owen Sound, Grand Bend to Port Rowan come together to worship and serve. And by Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you may be. We welcome you back to another edition and another season of the Vicar's Crossing podcast. Vicar's Crossing is a virtual space where faith intersects with the public square. My name is Rob Henderson, and I serve as the priest at Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Memorial Anglican Church in London, Ontario.
All right. Still the same job since we last talked. That's great.
That's right.
I feel happy to announce the same. My name is Kevin George. I'm the Dean of Huron, Rector at St. Paul's Cathedral in downtown London, beautiful downtown London, at a corner of Richmond and Queen. We are at the heart of the city with the city at our heart, is what we like to say around here, Rob.
Very good. Very good.
Yeah.
And no, we're glad to be back. This is our 11th season, Kevin.
11 seasons, buddy.
My God, you wouldn't know. We look exactly the same as we did 11 seasons ago.
I look exactly the same.
I think this is the same shirt that I was wearing.
Yeah,
I don't buy a lot of new clothes.
To be fair, I am parting my hair on the opposite side now.
That's true too. Yeah. But we are so glad you're back with us. We've got a great season ahead for you.
Yep.
So please make sure you're tuned in and take part wherever you may be. We want to kick off this first episode of our 11th season with a wonderful guest today. I think we were going to try to talk to Grace last year, but we weren't able to connect. So we're glad we can do it today. We're excited to welcome to the podcast Grace Ji-Soon Kim. So a little bit about Grace and what a wonderful bio she has. Grace is author or editor of 24 books. She is host of the Madang podcast, which holds conversations on Christianity, religion, and culture. Grace has been included in Inglewood Review's review of books list of the 10 important women theologians that you should be reading. And we know after today's podcast, you'll be getting out there to pick up one of her books if you haven't already read it. And she is included in their list of books to read for her book, Our God is Too White, Diversifying Our Theology. Sojourners included Grace as one of 8 Christian women shaping the church in 2023. Eerdmans included her in their 5 great women scholars and their books. And Grace is also an ordained minister of Word and Sacrament at the Presbyterian Church in the USA. She was born in Korea, and this is wonderful for Kevin and I too, because she was grew up and raised here in London, Ontario.
Yes, sirree.
And
not very far from your church, by the way.
Right. Yeah, I'm going to ask her about that. And she teaches now and writes in the United States. And her latest book is When God Became White, Dismantling Whiteness for a More Just Christianity. So that's a little bit about Grace. We'll chat about her book and the work she's doing to dismantle whiteness in today's episode of the Vicar's Crossing.
Yes, sirree. And we want to begin, as we talk about dismantling whiteness, one of the most important things, of course, that we have to address is colonialism. And Grace writes a lot about that in this book, in fact. So we're always mindful here to begin our podcast by acknowledging the ways in which some of us have disproportionately benefited from white supremacy, and acknowledging that the land upon which we record this podcast are the sacred lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehoik, and Attawandaron peoples, and these are lands connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. We know these lands to be continue to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples, Inuit, Métis, First Nations, and all people with whom we wish to work together towards a process of reconciliation and truth-telling, an opportunity for us to walk the two-road path together in justice. So lots on that, and let us all consider ways. And I'll tell you, this is a good book to consider. You get to see the impact of
Right.
colonialism and of whiteness. So, yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now we haven't been able to get to our 11th season without some support from some generous sponsors. And once again this year, we are so glad to have back on the Vickers Crossing our sponsors for season 11. First to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London, Middlesex, both family owned and operated. And to Dave Mullen and the staff there, we say a big hello and a big thank you again for sticking with us and being part of the Vickers Crossing.
Amen. And a shout out to the Diocese of Huron for their support, a community where families and individuals from Windsor to Owen Sound, from Grand Bend to Port Rowan, come together to worship and to serve. We're thankful to our bishop, the Right Reverend Todd Townsend, and all the folks at our diocesan office for the support they give to this podcast.
Mhm. And to Molly Maid, make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. And again, thanks and hello to Tricia Lister, who has been a great friend of the podcast, and glad to have her and the gang back with us again.
Say, Rob,
Say, Kevin.
here's a word about who we have coming up this season so far.
All right.
Okay, if it's just so
Let it
folks
rip.
might want to know, right?
Yeah.
So I thought I'll bring it up on my little handy. This is what they call an iPhone, Rob. Yeah.
Mhm.
So I have one of those, and
Yeah. Welcome to the
yeah,
2024,
yeah,
Kevin.
yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. I thought I was the only one.
Yeah.
I didn't think there was anybody else that had one of these.
Oh,
But
wait a
anyway,
minute. I found
so obviously we're speaking with Dr. Grace Ji-Sun Kim today.
Yeah.
Next week, we welcome Dr. Danielle Tuminio Hansen, and Danielle has been with us before. Her book, Speaking of Rape, was an incredible read, and the work is so critically important. And this time, she has released a book which actually just came out this week called Trauma Informed Spiritual Care. And so we're going to be talking about that. And this would be a good time to plug as well that on October 5th, Danielle is going to be in London. She's traveling here for an event co-sponsored by the Vickers Crossing, St. Paul's Cathedral, the Deanery of London, and Huron's Faculty of Theology, with support from ANOVA and the London Women's Abuse Center, where she will be speaking on October 5th in the evening here at St. Paul's in an event called Speaking of Rape, an opportunity to have honest discussions about intimate partner violence, something we know too much about here in London, Ontario, and the things that have come from that. The following week, we're going to be speaking to one of our sponsors, really, to the Bishop of the Diocese of Huron, Todd Townsend. Todd's been working on an incredible way forward for us called Turning to Grace. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. It'll be a chance for me and Rob to test out the boss on what it is where he's taking
That's
us,
right.
Yeah. What are you doing, boss? Where are we going? What are we doing? Following that, really excited to be welcoming Douglas Sanderson and Andrew Stobo Snyderman, for their book Valley of the Bird Tail, which is an incredible book. And again, it speaks to the nature of racism in this country as it relates to whiteness and in Indigenous people. Just an amazing book, an award-winning book here in Canada. We look forward to welcoming them. And our friend, the Reverend Michael Corn, will be joining us. His memoir is finally going to be released this fall,
Right.
and it's called Heaping Coals. Heaping
Yeah, great title.
Coals, yes, from media firebrand to Anglican priest being the subtitle. And so we look forward to welcoming Michael to the podcast as well. And we're in the process of booking a couple of other guests. We'll bring those to you as soon as we know them, but plan to be with us for any and all of those listening opportunities and in-person opportunities here. Oh, the other one I want to say is, you remember Kwakpui Land?
Yes.
And post-colonial Anglicanism. Well, Kwakpui Land is going to be giving the RT or lecture at Huron University
Huron,
College's
good.
Faculty of Theology in
Good.
November. And that Sunday, which is the Sunday of the 10th of November, I think, she will be guest preacher here at St. Paul's Cathedral. If you're in the London area, come and hear her. So that's a little bit that's been going on with our guests, Rob.
All right, good. So we weren't just laying around all summer.
No,
you were
no,
actually
God,
doing
no,
a little work. Yeah.
I did it from the brewery in beautiful Dildo, Newfoundland.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
sat on the deck at the Dildo Brewing Company and invited some guests on the podcast. They were all happy to join.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. Good.
Yeah.
Well, we'll look forward to another great fall and another great season here with all of our listeners. So once again, thanks for being here, everybody. Grace is, I believe, coming into our Zoom room here. Grace Ji-Sun Kim. We're going to talk about her book and much, much more right here in the Vickers Crossing.
Come on in.
And Grace is here at the Vickers Crossing podcast. And Grace, welcome to our podcast. And we're so thrilled that you could give us some time today to talk about this great new book that we're going to get into. And we're also very excited, as we mentioned to our listeners in our opening, that you're kin here because you're in a way a Londoner, aren't you?
Yes, I am. I grew up in London.
That's
Yeah.
awesome. That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. And not too far from my current parish. So we were
Yeah.
chatting a bit about
Oh,
that
okay.
before we started to record. So that's
Yeah.
great. Yeah.
What I liked in the book, we'll come to some of this too, was how you the name of the apartments that you lived in, Frontenac, and it's not,
Yeah.
and you
Yeah.
said
Yeah.
it's nothing like the Chateau Frontenac. Is what you
No, it's not.
No, no.
I don't know if you've ever driven by 3
I
Frontenac
have.
Road.
I
Yeah.
actually
My
have.
Yeah.
sister went by about 5 years ago, and she says they did
Mhm.
they did a remake of the outside, at least. I'm
Yeah.
sure the
Yeah.
inside, when I was living there, it wasn't that nice. So I
Oh,
think
Yeah.
they redid a lot. That's what she
yeah.
said. She said it
Yeah.
looks much better now.
That's good.
Good.
Well, look, jumping right into your book, because I know your time is precious, and this, Rob and I can't recommend this enough to people, and certainly,
Oh, thank you.
certainly let our colleagues know here in London. It's a really powerful book. Your honesty in there is so greatly appreciated. You immigrated to Canada as a young child with your family, and you write with great honesty in this book about the racism you faced here in this community of London, Ontario. You described how exhausting really living in white spaces as a non-white person really is. You lived actually, as we said, just a few blocks from Rob's church there. And you described what it was like to start life in Canada in kindergarten mid-year, writing that there were two overwhelming challenges. First, you write, being the deep culture shock, which shook you to the core of your being. And the second, being the overt and systemic racism you faced. And on that, you write, my Koreanness was an easy target for ridicule. It didn't matter whether I understood English or not. I felt their hatred and ridicule without comprehending a word they said. Kids would place their fingers on their eyes and pull them out sideways and laugh and make fun of my small Asian eyes. They would mimic Chinese intonations and phonology. You describe facing this almost daily, that teachers saw it and ignored it, and you say it was racism and it seemed to be sanctioned by the adults. I just wonder if you can share more with our listeners about what it was like here in 1975 in London, Ontario. I'd hope to think that some things have changed, but I know so many have not. And speak to us about how being conscious of race was something you became aware of here, because you wouldn't have necessarily known about race, this construct, as a Korean in Korea.
Yeah. So thank you for sharing that part of the book. So in 1975, January, we moved to London. We first landed in Toronto and just stayed a week or two, and then we moved to London, Ontario. So I attended Glencairn Public School from mid-year kindergarten, and it was like one grade per class. I don't know how it is now, like 50 years later. But it was all London was, when I grew up, was called WASP. So, white
Yeah.
Anglo-Saxon Protestant
Yeah.
group. And I remember that term all the way up to high school. I was there till grade 10. I went to Central High School, which is downtown. And I remember that term that, London is very white. And so in a white city, when a few of us Korean immigrants came, kids never saw anyone like me, Asians. So it was on a daily basis. They felt it was okay to make fun of us. And so I think at one point there might have been 8 to 10 families, Korean immigrants living in those apartments. There's 3 there. But at sometimes there's only 2 or 3 families. So we were a minority. And in Canada we use visible minority. I think that's still the official term.
Yeah.
So we were, visibly different. We were made a minority. And so every day people were making fun of someone like me and the other Korean students. We couldn't speak English very well. We just came. And so it was really hard. We had recess. Kindergarten was probably once a day, but once you get into grade 1, it was twice a day or so. And then we used to go home for lunch, so you had to come back and wait outside. So all those times people made fun. After school, there was a Max Milk across the street. I don't know what's there now, but if we
Still,
walked over there, is it still Max
yeah,
Milk? Okay,
yeah,
I have to
yeah,
go check it out. I haven't been back to that
yeah.
area since I left. But just going into the store, even the store owners made fun of people like me. So
Mm.
it was really hard growing up in that small city. And you would think when you're 5 years old, you may not remember. I remember things so
Oh,
clearly.
it's
Mhm.
traumatic.
All the, yeah,
Mhm.
all the,
Mhm.
um, you know, ching chong, all those
Mhm,
derogatory terms were used. So
mhm,
it was not easy growing up. And
right.
so I reflect on it in this book. I do a lot of other reflections in blogging and some of my
Mhm,
other writing because that's painful. That should not be happening.
no.
Right.
And,
Right.
it continues today.
So
So this is a big problem.
I
Mhm.
think what I felt when I was reading that, and this will be a bit confessional, I guess, because I grew up in small town Newfoundland. Okay, so
Oh, okay.
right, so it's I think the community I grew up in back in the
Yeah.
day was like 250 people. I went to a very small school that took in a lot of little communities, and nobody
Uh-huh.
looked any different than us, right? So when we were presented with that for whatever reason, if it was a visitor or the once in a odd while who maybe a student would transfer in, I read your words with some pain in my heart, knowing I participated in that sort of taunting.
Mm,
That
mm.
that a part of the work that I find myself doing in this stage of my life is unpacking so many of the things I learned as a kid.
Well,
Uh,
thank you so much for sharing that.
yeah,
That's very
I,
important for me to
I
hear, and I'm sure others.
yeah, I think I'm ashamed to think that I thought that way, but I really didn't know any different. It's what we were raised with in
Mhm.
many ways, and I just think that if we're going to get anywhere, we have to be honest. Because I read the pain that you put in that, and it just cuts me, I literally felt myself physically going, you know what, I did that.
Yeah.
I've
Yeah.
made I've been the
Absolutely.
person I've been the person taunting. And
Yeah.
as somebody who was badly bullied in school for a whole bunch of different reasons,
Uh-huh.
it shames me to think that that was what I did, right? So
Oh,
anyway,
okay.
yeah.
Thank you
Uh,
so much for sharing that. We need to hear more
mhm.
people kind of share those stories
Mhm.
because everyone that was in that school did it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Almost
Absolutely.
everyone.
yeah,
Yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. No, and
I
I
hope
can.
that people will come to realization like you.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
can certainly. Yeah, I can certainly echo that from what Kevin said because I was one of those children in the 1970s that was going to Riverside Public School in London, and so
Uh,
I can picture that context as well. So,
Yeah.
and I was part of that too. Um, so let's talk more about the book here, When God Became White. Let's talk about white a little bit because you certainly delve into that throughout the book, which is important. And you talk about white as a relational term. So I just wanted for our listeners just to read a couple of paragraphs here, and then I have a question on the other side for you, Grace, if I could. You're right that whiteness is a cultural space with political power and privilege, with a goal and an agenda to keep people of color marginalized, oppressed, and subordinated. Whiteness is a learned behavior that is multidimensional, complex, extensive, and systemic, which becomes a powerful tool for white people. Whiteness is not just skin color, but goes beyond it as an idea based on beliefs, values, and attitudes with an unequal distribution of power, influence, and privilege based on skin color. It is about how the powerful determine who has the privilege of being white and who does not, and hence push them down the ladder of hierarchy. Whiteness becomes a construct created by those in power to maintain their own power, their own dominance and status quo. It keeps whites at the top of the hierarchy, possessing power, supremacy, status, privilege, wealth, and domination. Whiteness groups all people in the United States of different ethnicities, like Irish, English, French, German, and so forth, with fair skin as one people. The purpose is not to find a common ethnic name for these people, but rather whiteness is a term of ethnic erasure, you say.
Mm.
Consequently, the distinct histories and ethnicities of people in this group are erased by being made white.
Mm.
This term white creates privileged groups in relation to all non-white people on the basis of whiteness. Whiteness patterns social interaction and social organization between whites and people of color, It builds barriers between groups of people as either privileged or marginalized and unfavorable. Lisa Sharon Harper calls whiteness a phantom. I wonder if maybe we could unpack that a bit. Can you talk more about perhaps this phantom and the construct of color and problems that flow from these false boundaries that you speak of?
Yeah, so in the book, I do a whole kind of historical overview
Mhm.
of how race is constructed, because these terms are all socially constructed. They're not biological, so we have
Right.
to keep that in mind, because I think many people think that race is biological, and we see this during times of war. So World War II, some people, they measure brain size and think one group is smarter and better than another. It's all based on biology, but we have to understand it's a social construct. So even this term white people and whiteness is a constructed term to keep a certain group of people in power. And today it's white people in power. So it's this term, it's a kind of a neutral term. And if it's a neutral term, then that means everyone else is judged by that term. So we're all judged by white people standards. And so the people of color will fall short of white people standards. And that's why you build this hierarchy, and white people are going to be at the top. So in that sense, it's a phantom term, and you can't kind of grasp it, but it's constructed, it's put into place, and we see the consequences. I think it's really stark in the U.S. You see consequences of this whiteness. It may determine how long you live, what medical care you're going to get, what zip code you live in, and what kind of education you're going to get. So, even though it's a social construct, it has all these repercussions. You can feel it. There are consequences of these constructs, and it really maintains this hierarchy of people with whites at the top and everyone else is at the bottom. And also this term, white people, we think, oh, it's always been with us. It's not always been with us. It was constructed when we think about the U.S. and how U.S. had enslavement. Before the term white, those who had slaves, the enslaved Africans and those who held them, the differentiation was not white and Black people, it was Christians and non-Christians.
Yes.
So the Christians were those who were slave owners, and non-Christians were the enslaved. But we had other Christian groups like Quakers and other groups who said, this enslavement is wrong. It goes against the gospel. And they were going out and preaching to the enslaved, various other groups, and then so slowly they became Christians.
Yeah.
So
Right.
that term it wasn't going to differentiate, and you needed to differentiate the enslaved and the slaveholders. So the perfect term was white. All the slaveholders were white, and then the enslaved were the Africans, the Black people. So these terms have come about, and we have to understand why they are there. And it's very fluid, because those who are white, some groups were not considered white 50 years ago are now white. So an example would be the Irish were not considered white, but today they're all considered white. And even the term Black, I spent over a month this summer in Australia, and I spoke different places. And, with every, like Canada, US, and Australia, it is a big problem of what the Christians did to the Indigenous peoples and Native Americans and the First Nations in Canada. So in the US, when we think of Native Americans, we think of them as brown people.
Yeah.
I don't know. I can't remember how Canadians view the First Nations. Is it brown or people
Yeah,
of
I
well, you
don't
don't
hear
use.
I don't hear
Yeah,
a
I
lot
don't
of
hear.
color. I don't hear a lot of color
Yeah,
in that
that's true.
conversation.
I don't remember. Yeah, I
Yeah.
don't remember that conversation either.
Yeah.
But in Australia, they are Black
They are
people.
Black people. Yes.
Yeah, so it's
Mhm.
interesting how
Yeah.
these terms are very fluid. And in Australia, the First Nations people, the Aboriginal peoples,
Aboriginal.
some are really dark and some are
Yes.
really light.
Yeah.
And they were I met a lot of them. We had a meeting too, a conference, and they were telling us that the dark skin of the Aboriginal peoples is recessive. So every time they many of them were raped,
Mhm.
but when they produce kids with white Australians, they become more and more white.
Right.
But still, the Aboriginal peoples are just considered Black people.
Yes.
So it's interesting how these terms are
It
used.
is.
It's used to oppress people, it's used to marginalize people. But the conversation of color wasn't there when I grew up about the
No.
First Nations or the Aboriginal living in Canada. Yeah.
And that's not to say that there's not a lot of racism involved.
Oh,
around
there's
it,
so much
No.
racism. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
and in fact,
That's
that
what led
takes
to all of this problem with,
Yeah.
the
Right,
Aboriginal
yeah.
peoples.
For
Yeah.
sure.
Exactly. And that takes me to my next question, actually, which is it's impossible, really, I think, to separate this conversation about race from colonialism, right? Like
Yeah.
the consequences of which the world over we're all struggling with today. And as you put it, white Christianity and missiology are intertwined with colonialism and has had a long, devastating effect all over the world. You outline that there are 4 weapons employed in white Christian conquest: genocide, enslavement, removal, and rape. And just a short paragraph from the book, you write, the death toll for the colonization project from 1493 to 1899 is estimated to be around 50 million. Hear that number, 50 million people,
Yeah.
about 90% of the Native American population. In the 20th century, one colonized nation after another fought to be liberated from colonial domination. The quote unquote civilized Christian West fought to maintain colonial dominance as long as it possibly could, as it benefited them financially, politically, and religiously. The brutality and enormous force against natives is unfathomable. The sheer acceptance of white Christians' acts of violence against natives as legitimate and acceptable is hard to swallow, especially if the key message of Christianity is love your neighbor. As we were just talking about here in Canada, we struggle with the effects of the genocidal policies of residential schooling. In recent years, it's been the unearthing of children's graves, schools with cemeteries. Like it's just unconscionable. Never mind the whole project and the link to Australia, by the way, and that the Australians came here to learn about residential schooling and brought that back
Brought it back.
to
yeah.
Australia. So I mean, as you talk about the fluidity of it, it's not just, it's like spreading. We spread this disease.
Yeah.
And you offer some other examples. I mean, we've had some guests on here. We talk a lot about the long legacy of racism in this country around First Nations, Indigenous, and Métis people, and Inuit. But you offer other examples in the book, like, for example, I was privileged to benefit or to be on the Korean Peninsula a few years ago and tour your beautiful homeland. And it was there that I learned about Japanese colonialism that I didn't know anything about. I wonder if you can share some of that with our listeners to give a sense that this colonial project is not, sometimes we think it's just here, but it's a global problem.
Yeah. Well, when we think about Christianity and how it spread under the Roman Empire, and it was all colonialism. It was taking over the land and under Constantine, spreading Christianity and converting them. And when we think about the Crusades, it's just another form of this colonial project. It's just one event after another of trying to dominate over people, taking their land and their resources and trying to preach this missiology of whiteness. So it's part of this whole Christian history and what Christians did as they, the settlers from Europe coming into Canada and the US. And when the prisoners were sent to Australia from England, it was this whole process of colonialism. It was this mentality that white Christian settlers were far superior, far better than the barbaric First Nations people, the Eskimos, the indigenous peoples, the Native Americans. It was that mentality. And, it was a blessing from the church that said, go ahead and colonize these people because they don't have the good news.
Yeah.
Manifest destiny in the
yeah.
US. Yes. And the doctrine of discovery, those are all these teachings from the Pope and from the church saying it's okay and to go and conquer because, the land is not inhabited by Christians. So of course you can take them. Of course you can kill these people or, put them in residential schools later on. Let's do whatever we want because they're not Christians. So let's do this. So it's a horrible part of our Christian history of this colonialism to go and colonize people and, you know, feeling that white Christians are far, far superior. So that is all tied in with the understanding of whiteness, that, somehow they are the neutral group of people. They become the standard and everyone else is measured. And the First Nations, the Eskimos, are not as good. They're not as educated and they're not Christians. So of course you can do whatever you want to rape them or murder them and take their land. So I think Christians have amnesia all the time. We don't want to think about our past. People in our churches don't understand or the vocabulary of doctrine of discovery. We don't talk about it in our churches. Manifest destiny, we don't talk about it, so nobody knows. They just think, oh, we were all these white settlers, they were so nice and they were going to teach the natives all these great things, but no, many of them died. They were murdered or through disease and takeover they died. So I think Christians love to forget or just remove it from our history, but I think we really need to talk about it and reflect on it. What are we going to do of the horrible past that we have? Because Christians, as you kind of ended the little talk, we are to love one another, but we've always in the past and even today have done the opposite. So I don't understand why we're like this.
Yes,
And that's one of the reasons why I keep writing the books, because it doesn't make any sense to me.
And you're doing them well. Great books.
You're doing them well, and they're well needed, and and that's why we wanted to do a podcast like this to help share some of that with folks. And
Amen.
so I let Kevin and I obviously live in the world of church, and it would be a very vast understatement to say that there's some patriarchy in the church, and we're quite knowledgeable of that as we sit here today. But wanted to touch a bit about that because you do deal with it in the book, especially how it connects to our understanding of God and our understanding of the divine. And these are the circles Kevin and I obviously work in. Who is this God who creates us, loves us, and how do we understand that? But so one of the chapters in the book in your book is called Dealing with a White Gendered God. And you begin the chapter telling a little bit of a story about a food fight. I always like a good food fight story that you witnessed when you were younger, and it was at church, right? It was at church after service. There was a luncheon, and a couple of these older guys started getting into an argument. And next thing you know, the food's flying everywhere. It's all on the floor, and bowls and stuff are all over. But you point out that what happened, as is the case in so many places, and I've seen it too, is what happens is the men sit back down, and all the women come running out and start cleaning up everything, right? And as a youngster with this, you write that it became very clear to me in that moment that it was a man's world at church. Even as a youngster, you're seeing that. So this opens up your exploration of patriarchy in the church and in religion. And you write about a traceable history of that patriarchal nature in religion, and you say patriarchy is embedded in the historical, cultural, and religious practices of society. The long history of patriarchy has influenced how we view the divine, how we view the world, and how we treat one another. So why is it so important for those of us, especially in the church, to see through this historical lens? And could you help us understand how seeing through that lens plays out in our understanding of God and our understanding of the divine, because they are connected?
Yeah, so not to give everything away, I hope many of your listeners will go out and order When God Became White. But, I grew up in a patriarchal church, a patriarchal society. It was not easy. And to witness that incident and many others, I never had a woman pastor when I was a child or a young adult. I never saw any woman pastors. I realized it was a male space within the church, and women were told to be silent. Women were told to obey. Young girls, obey your fathers, and wives, obey your husbands. So basically, that's the message that I learned in the church. And I think how we view God always impacts our own thoughts, our own behaviors, our ethics. So if we continue to view God as a white male God, so in the book I deal with the whiteness of God, and then the gender, the maleness of God. So if we continue to pursue and teach and preach about that, I think we lose out on the fullness of who God is, because no one has seen God. So you and I, as pastors, we have not seen God. No one has, but we're so free to proclaim that God is an old white man sitting on the cloud. So in the book, I go over some of the artists, and I hope those who are interested in art can dig into those chapters and reflect more on how art informs us and changes our thoughts and ideas. But I think it has big consequences because we don't see, if we use those masculine languages and images, we don't see the fullness of God, the feminine side, the gentle side, the loving side. And if we're going to preach about God, we need to talk about the fullness. And, I dig into the scriptures, and there's plenty of images, words, and languages about the feminine understanding of who God is.
Yeah. And I found too, just in just Bible studies that I do, or book studies, when you put that image out there for people, they're for a lot of them, their eyes go wide open. Oh, I never saw that before, right?
Yeah.
But holding it up to
Yeah.
them, they're very, actually, I found anyway, they've been very receptive to that.
I think people
Yeah.
are liberated.
But it's not,
People are liberated by it.
Exactly.
Yeah,
When we
that
talk
there
about,
is this. Yeah.
like God holding like a wing under the wing, that very
Yeah.
kind of
Hand, yeah.
female
Mother
imagery
hen.
of that mother hen, like that kind of stuff. Whoa. So yeah, it's important. So one of the chapters of When God Becomes White, we talked about that, and you're right also about our pressing need to kind of liberate ourselves from whiteness, white supremacy, and racism. More and more in our context, we're meeting folks in our churches, especially from Africa and Asia and the Middle East, and they're coming to London. We've had a lot of new families in our area over the years. They're making their homes here, and they're arriving at our churches. St. Stephen's, which is now called Holy Trinity St. Stephen's, the parish I'm at, is a small congregation, but we've recently just had 3 new families from Africa that have come into our community. And we've got parishioners from Barbados and Antigua that have been here for a while. But my point is that the faces that look like mine and Kevin's are not the faces of our churches today. And we're seeing that more and more in
Thanks
our
be to God.
community. Yeah. Which is, of course, a great opportunity to do this work of liberation that you speak of. And you're right that the oppressive male white image of God needs to be liberated and freed. And when this happens, we will view God through the lens of not only white people, but also Black, Asian, American, Native American, Hispanic, and invisible people around the globe. People
Preach.
can bring their different languages, concepts, words, and experiences to widen and expand our limited understanding of God. So what would you say, Grace, to, mostly those white communities that are seeing these new families coming into their midst? And how can they do that work of liberating ourselves from whiteness, that important work that you talk about?
Oh, I think that's so important. So I think, as our churches become more diverse, I think we have to really work on intercultural ministry. I have an edited book called Intercultural Ministry. So, how are we going to welcome this diversity? Because it's this, community of different people, and we really need to welcome them. And I think part of it is we got to dismantle this white male God, which is very exclusive. So, and to welcome Africans and South Americans and Asians into our community, because we know that the white churches are dying. The immigrant churches are actually growing, and they're doing well. So, for smaller cities where you may not be able to have an African church or African Canadian church, as they come into the white spaces and white churches and white communities, we really need to tackle racism, because racism, it's not like the churches are not infected by racism. Churches can be one of the worst places of racism.
Absolutely.
So I think, right now I'm doing this online group study. It's mostly United Methodist ministers, but on this book, When God Became White, it's so important that the ministers deal with this and teach about it, and have group studies about this concept of whiteness and dealing with white privilege and racism. Because if the church doesn't deal with it, the people of color or those who are African and South American will leave. Because you go into the workplace and you experience racism. You don't want to go to church and experience it too there also. So I think the churches really need to deal with this problem.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the things about the book that I was really appreciative of is at the back, there are discussion and reflection questions.
Yes.
So if there are pastors listening now or colleagues of ours, and it could go, oh, I don't have time to put together a book, it's already done.
So
all you got to do is gather people around and use that. So
and I will say on that, Grace, October the 3rd, right? You're in town. And so watch for us. We're going to get something out there soon, Rob and I, and maybe we'll assemble a small group to go through this book. And there'll be an opportunity to talk to Grace if we can make it happen. One last question before we let you go. And to thank you again for this incredible piece of work, because it really is something every church member should be reading.
Thank you.
So let's finish with a word on discipleship, right? Because it sort of goes to what you were just talking about. So we, just like Rob, our church here at the Cathedral, which is downtown, this is less a WASPy city than it ever was, right? Like people are coming from the world over now. And when I look out on any Sunday morning, we're not a big congregation anymore, but easily 20 to 30% of the congregation is no longer white. And so we have to stop behaving as if they are, right? It's that dismantling of this white God and so on. But how we get there, I think what I really appreciated about the near end of the book was about discipleship, because I think that following in the footsteps of Jesus becomes so critically important, right? You write that discipleship is about cultivating a Christ-like character in ourselves, and that when we recognize patriarchal constructs, the alienation and the alienation that it creates in our churches and society, we can look to see if Jesus reinforced it or not. And you give some examples of how he did not. And so I wonder if you can say a word or two about how discipleship can help us respond in just, faithful, and life-giving ways to help right the wrongs of generations of distorted views of God and of who's included in God's realm.
Yeah, so I think sometimes in our churches we present this white Jesus. So I go over that, how Jesus became white. But if we present Jesus as this Palestinian Jew, a dark-skinned Jew, we get a deeper sense of, this historical figure who lived during this Roman Empire and really fighting the empire, going against colonialism. And, at that time when the Israelites had tension with the Samaritans, when we see the life of Jesus, he was always reaching out to the people that were outside of the community, to the Samaritan, and welcoming the Samaritan woman at the well, having this discourse. And I think sometimes we gloss over these details, but I think it's really important. Jesus reaching out to the lepers and healing them. They are the most outcast people. So we can just think about who are the most outcast people today, whether they're be in our community or worldwide. We know what's happening in different parts of the world. So I think if we're going to really follow in the steps of Jesus, we have to look at his life, what he did, and follow it. And so I think if we become this disciples of who Jesus is, it really then helps us to dismantle this racism, because that's exactly what Jesus was doing. He was saying, everyone come and everyone is going to be fed. Go and do it to the least of them. And the least of them were the poorest of the poor. So, we're all okay about it at church, but I know if we're like a middle class church and a poor person walks in, everybody gets a little nervous,
Now what do we do?
What do we do? What's the theory? In theory it sounds good, but then we get all uptight. They're going to make our churches dirty, and it's going to smell and all that. So, but I think this sense of discipleship is so important. So I hope the readers really reflect more deeply on it, and And yeah, thank you for
There it
holding the
is.
book up. And I need to take a photo of of it. But I think
There
it's
we
so
are.
important, yeah, that we do this and
Yeah.
to really engage in discipleship.
Good.
So thank you
Yeah.
so much for all the questions and comments that you shared. I really appreciate
Well,
everything from both of you.
thank you, Grace, and we hope to be able to connect in October. We'll be in touch for
Yes.
sure. When
Uh-huh.
God Became White, Dismantling Whiteness for a More Just Christianity is the book. It's available now. Grace, thank you for being on the Vickers Crossing podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been a joy and to meet some other people from London, and it's great. So hope to meet you in person.
And once again, we thank Grace very much. Grace Ji Soon Kim, the author of When God Became White, Dismantling Whiteness for a More Just Christianity. A great read and a great guest. And hopefully we can see Grace back in London sometime soon and
Yeah,
joining
amen
us
to that.
for a get-together. I want to thank our sponsors again on the Vickers Crossing, to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London, Middlesex, both family-owned and operated, to the Diocese of Huron, a community where families and individuals from Windsor to Owen Sound, Grand Bend to Port Rowan come together to worship and to serve, and to Molly Maid, make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today.
Yes.
We'll be back in a week or so, Kevin, with another edition of
Yep.
the Vickers Crossing.
Another
Season
week.
11 continues.
Yep, Danielle Tumminio Hansen next week.
Mhm.
So watch for that. In the meantime, I'm going to see if I can get some lighting in here, man.
Yeah, would you please see
I
if you
don't
can
know,
find
maybe.
some old candles in that cathedral somewhere?
There's got to be something around here.
Light her up. Yeah, we
Yeah.
could do that. All
Yeah.
right. Thanks for being here, everybody. Thank you to Grace. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you,
And
buddy.
remember to always look both ways.
Before you cross the street.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Ian, with original artwork done by Elizabeth Dodman. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vickers Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vickers Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks!